Welcome to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I'm DT Kane, author of the epic fantasy series The Aggresfar Saga and the Spoken Books Uprising. Each week, I read from one of my novels, discuss my writing process, answer your questions, and have general discussions about fantasy fiction. It's like a book club, except I do all the work for you. Find show notes, info about all my novels, and much more at dtkane.com. Here's the show. Chapter 7. Baz didn't leave the library. Deliritus's supplies could wait. Instead, he made his way down into the bowels of Torchsire Library. He considered just going to his alcove and collapsing on his sleeping pallet for a while, but had too much angry energy for that. So he continued farther down, into the sub-basement. The air grew colder still, and he grasped the railing to ensure he didn't trip in the dark. A warm glow at the bottom of his descent guided him downward. The stairs exited into a long, narrow room. Instead of torches, it was lit by spoken, ever-glowing lamps, little glass baubles suspended from the ceiling by wire. They weren't actually ever-glowing, as they had to be renewed with spells every few months. That made them expensive, so even libraries tended to have only a few, but this space required them. It was Torchsire Library's conservator's laboratory, where Leanna worked on restoring books. A bit of the rage that had been bubbling in the pit of Baz's stomach subsided as he saw that Leanna was there. She was sitting on a stool that swiveled from side to side, bent over a workbench. She had a spoken book open before her and a quill in hand. Beside her was a glass jar of red ink that moved of its own accord, swirling within the container as if in a gentle breeze. Elemental ink, used to restore spoken books that had been overused and drained of their power. It was the next best thing to writing a new book, but that could only be done by a bound. No speaker had been permitted to write in hundreds of years, so no spoken books had been created since the burning. That, of course, was why the conservatory held so much influence in erstwhile without having an official seat at the table of Enya. They maintained the books that gave readers power, as well as holding close the secrets of elemental ink. The stuff was crafted in factories in the poorest sections of erstwhile, guarded by teams of enforcers. Very few were ever permitted access to the factories, and many of the poor illits who accepted, or were forced into, jobs in them never came out again. Leanna must have felt his eyes on her as she swiveled around in her chair. She had a circular magnifying glass strapped to her head, causing one eye to appear hilariously large as she looked at him. Baz couldn't suppress a laugh. She gave him a weak smile in return. "Back from Xavier Tower?" "Yeah," Leanna replied. "Delida was a bit hysterical." Baz grimaced. "She isn't going to get any better when she hears the Duke's plans for her." Leanna nodded in agreement. "I heard the news," she said. "About the trials, I mean." That eradicated the small bit of warmth Leanna's smile had kindled within him. "Yeah, I'm going on a trip." Baz stuck his arms out to either side in mock exclamation. Leanna frowned. "This is serious, Baztian. Don't they realize that Deliritus has done nothing to prepare you?" "Ha! Just this morning you were talking of how woefully underutilized I am. Haven't you any faith?" Leanna removed her magnifier and narrowed her eyes. Baz sighed. "Yeah, me neither. But it is what it is. Let's be honest. Deliritus doesn't stand much of a chance. He'll probably break a leg or something on the first day out, and I'll be back without missing a single night in the library." "Maybe," she said. Baz actually smiled a bit at that. It was nice to have someone even mildly concerned about his well-being. "I might still be able to get out of it. That's why I'm down here, to see if I can brainstorm any ideas." "Baztian," Leanna said, lips pursing. "You have a duty to perform, even if it is dangerous. Don't go getting yourself in trouble." He sighed again, slumping into a chair across from Leanna. "I know, but don't you ever, I don't know, get tired of serving them?" Leanna's brows lowered over her already glaring eyes. "You shouldn't be saying such things out loud." "Bah! What are you going to do? Tell the Duke?" "I should," she replied. "Life isn't always easy, Baztian, but that's the way it is." "Gee, I thought I'd find you a bit more sympathetic. Your mom was a speaker, after all." Leanna rolled her eyes. "Many conservators are born to speakers. Don't give me that. That's how it works. The children are tested, and the ones who are bound go into your line of work, and the ones who aren't get sent to the conservatory. None of us ever get to know our parents." Baz thought of asking whether she saw the cruelty in that, but didn't bother. As he'd said before, Leanna was better than most, but she was nestled into her place in society like everyone else. They'd just get into a fight if he kept talking. "Why do you keep that thing in here?" Baz motioned to a statue on a shelf above Leanna's workspace. It was a miniature replica of the full-size one in the conservatory, a pearly white book dragon, coiled up like a snake, its head sticking up. There was writing emblazoned across its forehead in gold script. Baz made a point of not looking at it. Leanna glanced at the figurine and shrugged. "Good luck. Lots of conservators have one. They were servants to the scribes, after all. It said they could even read." Baz tried to imagine a giant beast like that actually uttering words and shuddered at the thought. "The conservatory gave it to me when I graduated. That's my name written on its forehead. Some stories say that's how one used to befriend a book dragon, by reading its name, which was inscribed into its flesh at birth." "I've always thought they were an interesting choice for the conservators to favor myself," Baz said. "Haven't you heard the stories that say the creatures could speak and read?" Leanna scowled. "Dirty rumors perpetuated by cusses prior to the second burning. You really shouldn't repeat such lies, Baztian." A chill went through Baz at the vehemence in her words. "I think I'm going to visit the retirees now," he said, standing up. "Very well," Leanna said, still glaring at him. "But don't spend too much time in there. People already talk about it." "Do they?" Baz asked. That ought to have concerned him, but it didn't. He wouldn't stop visiting them no matter what anyone said. He couldn't. "I'm just trying to watch out for you, Baztian." "I appreciate that," he said. "Talk to you later." "Yeah." Leanna turned back to her workbench, and Baz walked out of the workshop into the cavernous sub-basement beneath Torchsire Library. It was frigid and dark, but those who lived there, if you could call it living, didn't need light, and Leanna at least ensured they had plenty of blankets. Baz groped along a wall until he found the pile of unlit torches kept there, then held one to a nearby brazier until it ignited. The sub-basement was a single open space that spanned the length of Torchsire Library, broken up only by large support columns. The immediate area around him was empty, which was odd. Torchsire had close to 24 retirees, and there were generally always a few congregating around the braziers spread through the space for warmth. The Duke seemed to go through speakers at an alarming rate, often retiring them at much younger ages than other libraries. He was cautious to the point of paranoia with them, always worried they were beginning to grasp the basics of grammar that led to reading. That, of course, contributed to the library's general state of destitution, as the Duke was always having to buy new speakers. "Baz?" said a crinkled old voice. "That you?" Baz turned to find an elderly man sitting on the floor, back against a pillar. He had stringy white hair that partially obscured his face, but not enough that Baz couldn't make out the strip of fabric wrapped around his head where his eyes had once been. "Yes, Gar, it's me. Good to see... sorry. Glad they haven't taken you away to listen to the sleeping words yet." "Huh. They'll never find me. I've been exploring these catacombs since the day the Duke took my eyes. Know every dark nook there be. How are you, Baz? You sound not quite as cheeky as usual." Gar had been down there so long the Duke, he was referring to was actually the current Duke's father, Deliritus's grandfather. Baz shrugged before catching himself and responding out loud. "I've had better days, Gar. You know where he is? Over in the corner, leading another of those fool songs of his. A waste of time, if you ask me, which no one has, of course." "Has to be better than sitting here alone in the dark." "Ah." Gar turned his head and spat to one side. "I've made friends with the dark." "Right." Baz shook his head, this time glad Gar couldn't see. "Well, talk to you later, Gar." "If I'm still here," the old man replied. Baz moved away from Gar. He hadn't specified which corner, but Baz knew. It was his favorite spot. Baz was pretty sure it was actually underneath the speaking room. He couldn't decide if that was fitting or sad. Maybe some of both. On the other side of Gar's pillar was a large group of retirees. They all wore plain white robes. At least, they'd been white at one point, but most of them were sullied and faded until at best they could be called a lighter shade of gray. Part of that was due to the fact they were all blind. It's tough to realize when you've stained your clothes when you can't see. But mostly it was just because Torchsire put as little funding into the retirees as it could, which meant unless they were falling apart, clothes weren't replaced. The fresh, white strips of cloth about the retirees' eyes stood in stark contrast. Somehow, those strips were changed on a regular basis, as if the readers wanted to be sure they never saw the evidence of what they'd done to the retirees. Most of the retirees sat cross-legged on the floor, swaying back and forth to the rhythm of an ethereal chanting that many of them were uttering. It wasn't quite a song, but neither was it plain old speech. It floated through the air, threatening to lift Baz out of his body and drift about the chamber. He felt himself involuntarily beginning to sway along with them. It was the language of creation, one of the many songs the man at the group's center had composed since he'd first joined the retirees 10 years prior. Tax was the only retiree sitting in a chair. He wore the same faded white robe and fabric across the eyes as everyone else. His olive skin had grown paler down here in the dark, and his face showed age lines, though he wasn't yet 30. But the only thing that stood out to Baz in that moment was his brother's voice, clear and strong as ever, but never harsh. The gossamer tune passed from his lips like silk down a blade's length, slow and precise, nearly surreal. Every now and then, one of the other retirees would miss a word or stumble over a pronunciation, but they always found their way back. Incredible, considering only about a third of the singers had been creators in their days as speakers. Tax had somehow taught them songs in other languages of the Trinity. There was no power in the words, of course, as they'd no books from which to draw power, but still, the way the sound caressed Baz's emotions. The tune went on for an indeterminate length of time. It never really stopped, just sort of faded away like a cooling breeze across Baz's shaved scalp. He couldn't have said when it begun and when it ended, but finally he realized he was just standing and swaying with his eyes closed, the tune no longer filling the chamber. He opened his eyes to find Tax with head down to one side, a smile just touching the edges of his mouth. "Beautiful," Tax said in a tone that evoked the same dreamlike feeling of weightlessness that the song had possessed. "You all improve every day. Practice on your own, and we'll sing again on rest day, 2 days hence." The retirees began to drift away to other parts of the sub-basement, a few stopping to murmur a word or two to Tax, but most simply moving off in silence. They stepped slowly, but Baz was always amazed at how they almost never groped or seemed to lose their way. "Baz," Tax said when the last of the retirees had left, "it's been days. I was growing worried." "You know, Tax," Baz said, "I started growing hair on my chest years ago. You don't need to worry over me like a kid anymore." Tax shook his head, still smiling. Baz felt a sudden urge to shout at him, but restrained himself. He owed Tax more than he could ever hope to repay, and then some. Shouting at him would not do. It's an older brother's duty to worry over his younger brother. But what's wrong, Baz? I hear the strain in your tone. Usually you'd have a much better quip than hair on your chest. Burning pages. Even blind, Tax was perceptive as a hawk. Why do you do that? Baz said, ignoring his brother's question. The singing. It's just something to pass the time. Oh, stop, Tax. You're the blind one. Tax laughed, a deep, beautiful thing that ripped a moment of joy deep from within Baz and brought a smile to his face. That's more like it. Tax chuckled to himself a moment longer before his face turned serious. It's like I've always told you, Baz. There's power in words. We might not be able to read them, but they haven't taken our voices. It's one of the few worthwhile things we can do down here. But, Baz said, you don't even know what they mean. Do you ever really know what words mean? What? What was the last destruction spell Deliritus had you speak? Hearing Tax utter the name brought a flash of anger to Baz's heart, but he tried to suppress it. He'd tried for years to insist that Tax hate Deliritus, but he always refused. A product of his environment, he couldn't help it, Tax would always say. So Baz did enough hating for the both of them. He asked me to light a candle a few months ago. Baz expected Tax to chide him for sarcasm. Instead, his brother asked, Well, what did the words of the lighting spell mean? What did they mean? Well, they told the candle to combust into fire and light, I guess. Did they? Isn't your will responsible for the end result? Well, sure. I mean, like you've always said, speaking isn't enough. You have to speak with intent. Baz nearly groaned at all the late nights he remembered where they were down in their room together without a book, when Tax had just forced him to stare at the candle's wick, working on focus. Of course, thinking of that always reminded Baz that it had been his loss of focus that had resulted in Tax being sent to where he was now. But, Baz continued, you still need the words for the spell. Certainly, Tax said, but is it the words that have meaning or your will that gives them meaning? Stop playing word games, Tax. It's no game, Baz. This is important. What did you feel when you listened to our singing? Baz shrugged. Peaceful, I guess? Yes. I think if you asked that same question to every retiree who either heard our song or participated, you'd get a similar answer. So, which of the words we sang told you it was peaceful? Baz glowered at Tax, which was completely ineffective since he couldn't see, but he said nothing, as he had no answer. That, Tax continued, is the whole point. The words permit you to express and teach and feel. You don't always have to completely understand them for them to have purpose. For an instant, that sounded like an incredible revelation, as if Baz was on the verge of grasping something profound. But it quickly slipped away from him. Here, Tax said, I want to show you something. He began to roll up his sleeve, and Baz gasped. He rushed forward and tried to push the sleeve back down, as if there were anyone around who could actually see, but Tax pulled back from him. There were words written on his arm. Not just written, but tattooed. Permanently. They were flowing and smooth, so they must have been of creation. Tax, what in the burning is that? It's some of the words from the song you just heard. It's my favorite. And, he said, voice heating with a fire it rarely held, it's a reminder that they haven't taken everything from me. Perhaps it's only a single word in a book of countless pages, but I can still stand up to them in this small way, even if I'm the only one who knows. The determination and anger and loneliness all wrapped up as one in Tax's tone took all the anger from Baz, hitting him so hard that he slumped back until he was sitting on the floor in front of his brother, as the other retirees had been. It didn't even occur to Baz until much later to wonder how Tax had managed to write the letters so perfectly in his blind state, or where he'd gotten the tools with which to do the tattooing, or how he'd learned to write at all. "You're not the only one who knows, Tax. I do, too. I know how strong you still are." Tax exhaled several times and nodded his head, then rolled down his sleeve on his own. "Thank you, Baz. It's good to know I'm not alone." "Alone? You've got all the retirees." "Perhaps," Tax said, voice soft, as if his mind were somewhere else. "But more often it feels as if they have me, but that I have no one. Except you, that is." They sat there in silence for a time, Baz swallowing hard on the pain caused by Tax's words. Finally, Baz said, "Delilah was hurt today. Is she all right?" "She will be, I think. There was a cityless captured by the conservators. They brought him here because they thought he could read. Called together all 9 libraries for a questioning." "A cityless who could read?" Tax murmured, as if it were a wondrous thing. "Yeah, I saw him, though I only got there for the very end of the questioning. He was raving something about a declaimer's transcendence and someone who would speak words for freedom or some nonsense like that." "He'll speak the words to set us free," Tax murmured. Baz narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, that's it. How'd you know?" "Dad. He used to tell me a story some nights when I couldn't fall asleep. I don't remember most of it, but it was about the Enigma, Pront v. Lextor. He survived the burning, or so the story went, and before he died wrote a spoken book that didn't seem to have any actual spells in it. Instead, it just made predictions. It was burned when Acktus Torchsire led the second burning, destroying any writings that weren't in the possession of the 3 cities' ruling libraries. But a little girl saved a few scraps, ripped them out before the book was taken, and she spent the rest of her days searching for the meaning in that line from the book, 'He'll speak the words to set us free.'" "Huh," Baz said. "So he was mumbling about a bedtime story while he was being tortured?" Tax lowered his brows, which made Baz a little uncomfortable knowing that his brother was trying to glare at him without eyes. "Dad always told me it was true." Baz didn't want to press. Now wasn't the time for an argument. "Well, anyway, the cityless managed to get free, and he hit Delilah in the throat before Rox, well, did what Rox does. She won't be speaking anytime soon." "But the trials," Tax said, "they start day after tomorrow. Does that mean—" "Yeah," Baz sighed. "Deliritus is saying I'm going with him now. I'm still trying to figure out a way to get out of it. Actually, I was hoping you might have some ideas." "Get out of it? Baz, this is wonderful. It's our chance. You go with Deliritus to Tome, find a book and secret it back and bring it here, and then we can—" "Tax, stop it. Books aren't just lying around in Tome. The place was picked over centuries ago. You know that. There's a reason they only send young idiots like Deliritus there searching on the trials. We'll be lucky to find anything at all, and if we do, you can be certain Deliritus will be watching it like a hawk the whole trip back. Or, more likely, have Rox guard it the whole way back. Besides, what would you do with a book anyway? You can't see." "You could read it to me." Baz's back stiffened at the suggestion. Sure, Tax had tried to teach him that once, but he'd spent the past 10 years swearing he'd never find himself in a position like the one he'd put his brother in. He intended to die with his eyesight intact, thank you, and he had eliminated anything that even suggested reading from his life. Baz avoided even relating stories he'd heard others speaking on the street for fear he might be accused of having read them somewhere. "I couldn't do that, Tax. You did a great job and all with me, But we didn't have enough time before, well, you know, and I've pretty much forgotten it all since then. Tax's enthusiasm didn't seem fazed in the least. Well, you must go anyway. If you never grasp at an opportunity for want of a better one, you'll never find one. Tax, come on, where's all that brotherly concern now? Hell, our Xavier is competing this year, and some girl from Colnar Library who I suspect has a pretty sick relationship with Pain. How safe do you think I'll be with them trying to stop Deliritus from reaching Tome? Baz, you have to do this. If nothing else, maybe you'll find a way to escape. Escape? Baz exclaimed. And leave you here? Tax, I'd never do that. His brother gave another of those smiles to the side that infuriated Baz. But it was fleeting this time, and he turned an imploring expression back to him. You must go. Do it for me. Baz sighed again. There went his last hope. Fine. Not as if I have much choice. And that being the case, I'd better be going. Deliritus is expecting me to pick up some supplies for this fool's errand I'm apparently taking with him. Be positive, Baz, and remember what I told you. There's power in the words. Right, Tax. Baz rolled his eyes at his brother, but then leaned over and hugged him all the same. I'll see you soon. I look forward to it, Baz. Well, at least one of them had something to look forward to. Baz had what he fully expected to be a month or more of misery, pain, and likely frustration ahead of him. A trip out into the wilds with only Deliritus and Rox for company, to face the dangers of the unsettled country, not to mention the duplicity of the other competitors. And the reward for reaching your destination? A search through the ruins of Tome, or Ratian's lost capital city, for yet-to-be-found spoken books, all while avoiding the fire-breathing worms and dragons that had taken up permanent residence there. Yes, the Acktus Trials were bound to be piles and piles of fun. All right. So, Chapter 7, hope you enjoyed that. Welcome back to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. This is Episode 6, and it is February 17th, 2022, as I record this. As always, a few personal updates here, and then we will launch into our discussion of a pretty significant Chapter 7 here, right? Shoot me an email. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 7. But for me, kind of a week of mini accomplishments here for me. Or almost accomplishments, anyway. Nearly done with my edits for Part 3 of the Spoken Books Uprising. Remember, I do those by hand. Actually, for those on YouTube, here's a little sneak peek here. No, I'm not going to let the camera focus on it anyway, really. No spoilers here, but here you can see all my my chicken scratch red lines there on Book 3. So that's going well. I think I decided I was just putting my newsletter together earlier. I'm like 94% of the way through, like Chapter 34 of 36, or maybe a little less than that, because there's actually a prologue to Part 3, the first prologue I've ever written. So you have that to look forward to if you're in it for the long haul here with the book club. And then also some other news: the cover for Declaimer's Discovery, which is Part 2 of the Spoken Books Uprising. So the book we'll be reading together once we finish up the Acktus Trials here. That is underway with my graphic designer, and we're just fiddling with a few final things on that, and then that'll be ready to go. And I think I'm going to do a reveal of that in the newsletter in a couple weeks. So if you want to see the cover, definitely hop over to dtkane.com and sign up for the newsletter. Like I've said before, that's just once a week on Fridays. And I always try to give you something free in there. It's like I said on podcast episode 1. I'd love to sell lots of books, but I also just want to get my stories out to everyone. So the more folks I can communicate with here through the podcast or the newsletter, the more people who can hear the stories. So that's a win for me. And that said, anyone interested in part 2 of Declaimer's Discovery, that's going to be coming out April 15th, and it is available for pre-order now if you'd like to get your orders in now. At least the ebook is. I can't put the print book up yet until I actually have a cover for it. At least I don't think I can. I haven't looked into it very hard, but anyway, the ebook is up for pre-order now if you're interested. Let's see, non-book news, started training for a half marathon this week. That's going to be happening, in May. I used to be, a lot heavier than I am now, and I've kind of taken up running in the past few years as a way to stay healthy. So, I've run the half marathon distance several times, but never in an official race. COVID is mostly to thank for that. I wasn't in a position where I could run half marathons until after COVID hit. So, but the one in May is an actual race, so I am looking forward to that and hoping it warms up here soon. I'm in the western New York area, so it's still pretty cold and dreary here, though. The temperature has at least poked above 40 here the past couple of days, so hopefully winter is on its way out, but if you've ever been to western New York, you know that we get about 3 or 4 false springs before the actual one, so I'm not holding my breath on that. Let's see, on the reading front, still reading the same books as last week, Vlad Taltos, the Book of Zureg, and listening to The Silence of the Lambs. Probably be wrapping both of those up here soon, so should have some new fiction reads to report to you either next week or definitely the following week. And just a couple housekeeping items here. I have in the past few episodes I've started putting names up of characters on the screen during the analysis section. I had some people suggest putting them up whenever I mention them, but one, frankly, that's a lot of work in the video editing process, and it already takes me a long time to edit the videos for YouTube, and the audio too. But I am putting them up the first time I mention them during analysis, so if you can't really tell what a particular name is, if you watch on YouTube, you can see them, and I'm also putting all the names in the show notes, both on YouTube and for the podcast, so you can jump down to the show notes if you need to clarify the name of a character in the episode. And finally, make sure to remember to submit your quest answers. There is still time. We'll be going over all of the quests on the first episode in March. So let me pull up my calendar here. So the first episode in March will drop on Monday, March 7th. Podcast comes out every Monday for those who haven't realized that yet. So actually, let's say Thursday, February 24th. Get those quest answers in. So a week from today as I'm recording this, February 24th. And we'll go over the answers and see who is the first winner. All right. So let's hop into Chapter 7 here now. Obviously, kind of a big surprise here about middle of the way through, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first we start out, Baz going down to the basement. He is, I think upset is probably the right word. He just had a fight with Deliritus, and he does, he thinks, this is, I think I said last week, this is kind of like the next worst thing to kind of just being sentenced to death, as far as he's concerned, going out on the trials. So we don't, it's not entirely clear why he's going down to the basement yet. Initially it looks like he's going there to see Leanna, and, he does immediately feel better when he sees her, right? Puts a smile on his face, and she's got this big, like the big magnifying glass on one eye, helping her restore a spoken book. So you can kind of picture the slightly humorous scene when she turns around with the huge magnified eye, right? And just more evidence of maybe the bit of the crush that Baz has going on with Leanna. Right, and we talked about this last week as well, and I think I said I couldn't remember if the book had actually gone over this yet, but we definitely get it here, this point that no new spoken books are being made because only bound, so people who are born with the ability to pull power out of the books, only the bound can create spoken books, and since all the bound are turned into speakers and never taught to read, they don't know how to write either, so no new books. So that drives home, another point of emphasis for why the conservators are still so powerful, even though they don't really have any say, at least any official say, in the government of erstwhile, because they hold all the power for keeping the books working, with their restoring, and they hold the secrets to the elemental ink as well, which we learned is created in factories that are kind of tightly guarded by the conservators, and they kind of conscript poor commoners to work in the factories, and lots of them never come out. So that's mysterious, and we'll learn more about. Sorry, there's a horn outside. If you heard that on the audio there, but we'll learn more about that actually in the next book. We'll actually see the inside of a ink factory in part 2. So stick around for that if you're interested. That'll be probably be starting that in the later half of 2022. I was doing a little math. I think sometime in June we'll be finished with reading the Acktus Trials here on the podcast and moving on to book 2. But right, so Leanna does show some concern for Baz, right? He kind of chides her because she's concerned. She's like, "Oh, you were just lamenting, a few chapters back, Leanna, how I'm so underutilized." But obviously, she's worried, just like Baz is, that he is not sufficiently prepared for the trials, since Deliritus never uses him for speaking. But there's also, and I will say, Baz does notice it's nice for someone to be even a little worried about him, right? Because we've seen Baz doesn't really have too many friends. It doesn't seem like we got that offhand comment back in the scene in the receiving room, how none of the other speakers really talk to him because they don't want to associate with the brother of someone who turned out to be a cuss, right? So a bit of loneliness going on there. So another reason you can see why he is attracted to anyone who shows him anything more than passive contempt. So, but there's definitely some conflict here between him and Leanna too. As Baz says, she is nestled into her place in society like everyone else. And she criticizes him, despite being worried, she criticizes him for saying he wants to get out of the trials, shirking his duty, I think she says, or something like that. So, she definitely, she's friends with Baz, but she's kind of a straight arrow, right? She's not looking to break the rules here. Baz is a speaker, and, he's got to do what the readers say. An interesting point there, we learned that Leanna's mother was a speaker, though that apparently isn't common, right? We haven't really seen how speakers are discovered yet, but Baz does note that children are tested at a young age, right? And if they turn out to be bound when they're tested, they become speakers, and those who aren't go to the conservatory. Now, obviously, there's a lot of vagueness there. So is it obviously not every child either goes to the conservatory or becomes a speaker, because we have the common illets as well. So there must be a little bit more to it than that. Though it's probably a pretty good bet if you test to be a speaker, you're going to be enslaved no matter where you're from, because we see how concerned society is with keeping that separation of powers between the people who are bound and able to pull power from the books, and and the elite reader class who know how to read but cannot pull power from the books. So that's a whole another interesting layer, ripping young children away from their families, right? If they test a certain way. So another demerit against the land of oration here, and what's the series called, right? The Spoken Books Uprising. So you can maybe see some groundwork being laid here for why there might be an uprising at some point here. Though obviously we are not there yet. Baz would be happy to stay down here in the basement, it would seem, rather than do anything that might suggest a rebellion. And we also see again another statue of a book dragon, right? This time it's a smaller one than the one in the conservatory. Leanna has it on display in her workshop. She says it's a kind of like a good luck charm for the conservatory. She got it when she had her initial graduation there and became a librarian. And she notes that at least stories say that book dragons could actually read, which that seems plausible, I guess, right? Remember we saw the book dragon back in the prologue. He could talk, so I guess maybe it's not so incredible that they could read as well. And there's even this legend that Leanna brings up. Book dragons have their names tattooed on their foreheads. That's interesting. Leanna says her name is written on the head of the book dragon statue that she has there, and Baz, of course, is careful not to look at it because he does all he can to avoid being associated with being able to read. But there it is, and apparently if you read a book dragon's name aloud, that's how you make friends with them. So a bit of interesting lore for the world here, but also maybe an implication that book dragons, they weren't friends with everyone, right? Just people who could read. If you couldn't read their name, they were, at least it would seem, they wouldn't become friends with you. So interesting point there. Maybe the book dragons weren't quite as altruistic as the one we met in the prologue seemed. So we'll store that away. We'll see a book dragon again here in the story. So not just dwelling on this for personal interest reasons. This will be a little bit relevant. Some of this anyway later on. Baz, right, he also chimes in that, he's heard a story that book dragons could read and speak, which, of course, Leanna doesn't like that. He's basically calling the conservatory's good luck charm a cuss, right? Of course, they wouldn't have a big statue of a cuss in the conservatory. So, Baz, maybe putting his foot in his mouth here a little, because they kind of, him and Leanna part ways here with obvious tension between them. But Baz goes off into the darkness of the sub-basement to go visit the retirees, right? And Leanna's like, don't spend too long over there. People notice how often you're visiting them. And Baz, Baz says, that ought to concern him, but it doesn't. And you wonder a little why. Well, why doesn't really say why that should concern him. But we kind of see that in a minute here. Baz says he's not going to stop visiting them no matter what, and why is that? And well, we all know why here. But right before we get to the chapter's big reveal, let's just go over Baz's meeting with Gar first, who is the older retiree he meets before the rest of them. And it's dark when he goes down to the sub-basement. He's got to fumble around for a torch, and we kind of learn pretty quickly why they don't bother with any lights down there. It's because all the retirees are blind. They've got these cloths wrapped around their heads where their eyes should be. Remember a few chapters back, we learned that the retirees are retired speakers, right? So when speakers outlive their usefulness, they're apparently blinded and sent down here into the dark. Why is that? Not really clear at this point. What does losing their usefulness kind of really mean? Baz noted a few chapters earlier that the retirees are used for breeding, right? So the libraries are still trying to create new new speakers, just another point on how demeaning the readers are toward their speakers. But, you'd think there's probably more than that, right? Because we saw that, at least Octagonal, and I think we've implied that other readers do this too, they blind speakers that they're still using. So, just, blinding isn't reserved just for these retired speakers who are, who have outlived their usefulness. So there must be something more to the reason why these speakers are kind of tossed into the darkness to be forgotten. And we'll learn more about that as the story goes on. Another interesting note here that we learned, Torchsire apparently has more retirees than other libraries. And Baz says, Octagonal goes through speakers at an alarming rate, right? Is this just because Octagonal is particularly cruel? Like I said, he's obviously not a nice guy, but, he blinds speakers who he's still using. So, what's the deal here? Especially since, Torchsire doesn't really have money to waste. And Baz notes, speakers are expensive. This is one of the reasons that Torchsire is down on money. They got to keep buying new ones because Octagonal keeps retiring them faster than most others. So it seems there's probably some reason here just beyond a fear of maybe them learning to read. Though, Baz does seem naive to this. This is me reading all into this, right? Because Baz is just like, well, they're tossed down here when they've outlived their usefulness. It doesn't seem he's perhaps thought it all the way through like we are here. So he meets Gar. He's a kind of this older man is leaning up against a column, the old codger, right? And I gave him a nice gravelly tone when I was reading the chapter earlier. He's been down there so long that the Duke that retired him was the Duke before Octagonal, Deliritus's grandfather. And Baz seems pretty familiar with him, so more evidence that Baz is down here a lot. And did you notice that Gar actually called him Baz? In like dialogue tags and stuff, we call him Baz. But Yeltax, his brother, was the only other person we've seen actually call him by that nickname aloud. Even Leanna calls him Baztian. We also see that Gar, can like immediately tell just by Baz's tone that he's kind of feeling down, right? So, just more evidence. Baz comes down here a lot. And Baz is like, do you know where he is, Gar? And Gar tells him that whoever he is, he's leading another of those fool songs of his. And who is this? Who is Baz talking about? And so we finally get it, right? Last week, remember I told you there's going to be a big surprise here in the chapter, and here it is. Yeltax is not dead. He is still alive, and suddenly we see why Baz spends so much time with the retirees. It's because his brother is one of them. Now, I am really interested to hear what you think. I think my editor actually commented to me that this twist here might annoy some readers. So I'm interested to hear how you reacted to this. Were you surprised, or did you see this coming? I won't lie. I kind of did some things to lead you to believe that Tax might be dead. But if you go back and read carefully, I never actually say that. We hear about Tax's pained screams a few times, and Baz talks about what Deliritus did to his brother, but we never say Tax was actually killed. Also back in chapter 4, there was a little bit of foreshadowing, very subtle here, but Baz is talking about Helfax Erstwhile, who is the founder of the city of Erstwhile, which the story thus far is taking place in. And Baz, he noted that, Helfax couldn't have been all bad because he had a crippled brother that he took care of. And then Baz immediately chided himself for thinking of that. And, it wasn't entirely clear at that point why Baz was kind of berating himself for thinking like that. But now we do see, right? He was, he has basically a crippled brother, right? So it's not something he necessarily wants to be thinking about. So, again, let me know what you thought of this. Was this a satisfying surprise, or did you feel like I was hiding the ball from you or cheating here a little? I hope you didn't feel like that, but I'm also constantly looking to improve my writing craft here, so I'm happy to hear some criticism as well, as long as you keep it relatively gentle. so definitely write me at dtkane at dtkane.com. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. Okay, right. So, so not only is Tex one of the retirees, he seems to be their leader, right? All the other ones are just kind of standing around or sitting on the floor. And, let's just paint this picture here for a minute. It's kind of eerie, a little even surreal. Right? Tex he's the only one with a chair, right? So he's kind of in the middle, and all the other retirees are circled around him. It's dark. Baz has a torch, and besides that, it's got kind of like braziers full of coals kind of scattered out through the sub-basement, and you got all these people in just dirty white robes and, linen wrapped around their heads where their eyes should be, a little bit haunting, and they're all standing around in a circle singing a sad song too. It's slow and precise. We read in the text, and almost kind of enchanting, right? Baz, as soon as he starts hearing it, he starts swaying along, and involuntarily kind of gets lost in the music. Puts him in a trance almost. A cooling breeze across Baz's shaved scalp. So calm and ethereal. Baz says he didn't even realize when it ended. Just all of a sudden kind of realized he was still swaying back and forth, and the music was just over. The song does finally end, and kind of the gathering breaks up, and we're just left alone with Baz and his brother here. And Tex is still the older brother, right? He's he's worried about Baz. You haven't come to visit me in a few days. I was concerned. Baz, of course, with his typical one of his typical responses. I started growing hair on my chest years ago. Baz tells him, stop worrying, big brother. And then Baz kind of deflects Tex, asking why he's not feeling good, or why he's feeling down. Why the singing, Tex? Why do you do that? You do that all the time. And Tex tries to now Tex tries to evade the question, right? No, it's just to pass the time, Baz. But Baz pushes him. I'm not. You're. Again, Baz obviously feels very guilty, right, about his brother, and we'll get to that. We'll discuss that a little bit in a minute here. But still got the sarcasm. When Tex tries to play down the singing. No, you're the blind one, Tex. Baz says, tell me what's really going on here. We get a little bit, we're waxing poetic here, talking philosophy for a second. Baz's brother seems to, he's full of high ideals, right? There's power in words, Tex tells Baz, and like I said, getting a little philosophical here, but we get a little bit more description of what speaking a spell actually entails, right? And this was something I had to make a decision on very early on when I started writing the Acktus Trials, but I have not pulled a Tolkien here, right? I have not written my own languages. There are 3 different languages of the Trinity, right? Destruction, creation, and influence. I have not created a lexicon or a dictionary or anything for them. In fact, we don't actually see specific words at all. I went the route of you get to imagine the languages through my descriptions of what the words sound like. Instead, I thought at the end that was a better way to do it. And frankly, I am not interested in creating my own language, so I wouldn't have written the book if I had to do that. So So there you go. But we do learn from Tax's questioning of Baz that the words of the Trinity don't necessarily have black and white definitions like ordinary words, right? Let's see. This is the quote here from Tax is, "The words permit you to express and teach and feel. You don't always have to completely understand them for them to have purpose." And I think this, I know, and I know I'm sitting here, kind of saying that I like my own writing, right? But there are parts of my writing that I don't really care for, and maybe I should pull some of those out in future episodes as well. But this one, I like this little passage. There's a lot here. First, this is applicable to the real world, right? This is why language and reading are so important. They let us express feelings, help us teach and pass on knowledge to others. And it's also one of the reasons this world is so cruel, right? This world being oration. I mean, because the benefit of words and language are denied to so many people here, and that's kind of a meta level idea here behind the whole book. This idea of oppression through hoarding knowledge is in the background of this story and really the whole series. And we've even we've seen that even throughout world history, right? Where that's one way, autocrats and dictators and when small groups of people try to maintain power, that's you keep the common people as ignorant as you can if you're one of those dictator like rulers. And it's kind of the same thing here, right? Obviously this is in the frame of a fantasy novel, so it's magic being denied to most people. But you can look at it as a bit of an allegory too, right? I suppose so. Interesting there. At least I think it is. That's why I wrote it, right? But the second interesting point here, and more pertinent to the immediate story, is that Tax's songs are in the languages of the Trinity, right? And it seems the retirees are learning all three languages, since all of them seem to sing all of Tax's songs, regardless of what language they're in. So, does this mean Tax is trying to teach them how to speak all the languages? Baz takes care to point out, there's no power in the songs, right? Because the retirees don't have any books. But what if they did get their hands on some books? Interesting. They still wouldn't be able to see them, right? To know what spells were in them. But, think on that. Again, like I said before, you can bet that if something seems interesting, I didn't just put it in there because it's interesting. It's going to be relevant at some point. And I guess you can probably surmise that if I'm talking about it here in the book club, that it probably has some relevance as well. So just keep the songs in mind. They will be important here as well. But yeah, the importance of song in a society where most people don't know how to read. Interesting. Baz seems close to sort of a revelation here, but then Tex kind of like confuses him into letting the question drop. So, we don't get the full answer yet. There is another very subtle point here, though, just before we move on. Since the words of the Trinity don't have distinct meanings, that might imply that these languages are a little harder to learn than ordinary speech, I guess. I think you could look at it like that. You can't just do a direct translation of them. So, if you've got someone who knows the ordinary speech, it's not as simple as saying, well, this word is this in destruction or creation. It doesn't work that way. We saw that the Phoenicians, I don't know, one of the first written languages. Now it's totally blanking me now. I am not a linguist or historian of language by any means, but until we got the the 25, or now it's obviously the 26 character alphabet, the only kind of systems of writing were extremely complicated. So you had to be, you kind of had to be a scholar, or at least someone in a position to get a lot of education before you could learn to read and write. So maybe we got a bit of that here, where obviously the readers hoard knowledge of reading anyway. But even if they weren't, there's kind of a higher bar to entry to learning the languages of the Trinity than just learning ordinary speech. All right. So, like I said, Tex kind of he confuses Baz a little, but then he also completely distracts him by, he rolls up his sleeve and he's got a tattoo. And, it's a tattoo in words of the Trinity. Tex says it's words from creation, actually words from the song that the retirees were singing when Baz first came up to them. And, Baz, he gasps, right? He is aghast. Tex is basically walking around now with evidence that he's a cuss, right? He tattooed the incrimination right onto his arm. And I remember how Leanna reacted when imagining someone who could, speak, or who could read and write, so this it really is like, almost just as bad as, committing murder and then just writing your confession in ink on your arm for anyone to see. But Tex's response to Baz's concern, there's the rebel in him hasn't totally died, right? We remember back in chapter 1, Baz, we've got to stand up to the readers, and that's why I'm teaching to read. So, I can't think of any better way to take care of you than to teach you the power that the books hold. It's kind of what Tex told him back in chapter 1. And regarding the tattoo, Tex says, I can still stand up to them in this small way. And maybe this even plays back into perhaps why he's teaching the songs to the retirees, right? Is he, is he getting them ready for an opportunity in the future when they might be able to, have an ability to speak actual spells, or maybe have someone else speak spells to them if they know the languages. So maybe some spoilers here, but I'm not giving you any specifics. And like I said, if you're digging into this, you got to know this is setting up something for the future. But we also, despite the rebel that we see here in Tex, obviously hasn't been all good for him. His tone is a mixture of determination and anger and loneliness, all wrapped into one. And despite having the other retirees, he feels alone. It feels as if they have me, but that I have no one. Tex says. So, it's not definitely not all happiness here. Tex is a blind man down in a basement, and he's been down there for 10 years now. You can imagine the kind of toll that takes on him. And Baz definitely feels guilty about this, right? This show of loneliness brings these feelings of guilt to the surface for Baz. He notes that it was his loss of focus that led to Tex's blinding. Fixing a typo here in the script, because I post the script, my script on my website dtkane.com. So if you're ever interested in kind of seeing the notes that I'm reading off of here, those are in blog posts attached to the video of the podcast each week on the website, if you're ever interested in checking those out. So if you hear me occasionally typing, it's because I'm correcting something in the script for when I post it later. But right, so Baz blames himself here. It was his loss of focus that led to Tex's blinding. And remember, that's a reference to back in chapter 2. Baz forgot to turn the page, right, and that's what resulted in the spell failing and the woman tripping and knocking the flagstone loose and revealing that book that Tex had stolen. Baz tries to reassure his brother, right? He's a good little brother, right? He comes down here and visits Tex all the time, and I know how strong you still are, he tells him. But still, obviously, he's upset all these years later. In another interesting note here, Tax doesn't seem to hold any grudge against Deliritus, right? He's a product of his environment, Tax tells Baz, which obviously this doesn't satisfy Baz, right? So Baz did enough hating for the both of them. So, maybe do we give Baz a little bit of a pass for kind of his childish behavior with Deliritus in the chapter, chapter 6 that we read last week? You can see, Baz has a lot of reason to really not like Deliritus. He kind of took away Baz's whole family because Tax was his only remaining family, and Deliritus kind of ruined that. So, definitely a lot of bad blood between the two of them, at least on Baz's side. Deliritus maybe seems a little more willing to kind of try to patch things up with Baz, but Baz certainly has no interest in that thus far that he's exhibited. Baz did enough hating for the both of them. A lot of vitriol, I think, packed into that one sentence there. Right. So finally, they get around to talking about the Cityless who was captured, and Tax seems pretty interested in that, right? A Cityless who could read, and interestingly, to Baz's surprise, he's actually also familiar with those words that the Cityless was shouting right before he charged Deliritus. I did kind of suggest to you a few weeks ago, maybe we'd see, the Cityless wasn't just raving mad, and here we go. Apparently those words he was saying, he'll speak the words to set us free. That's from a story called The Declaimer's Transcendence. It's a kind of a bedtime story, right, that Baz and Tax's dad used to tell to Tax when he had trouble falling asleep. And it went something like, the Enigma survived the burning. The Enigma, who Prompt V. Lextor, right, our friend from the prologue. So he survived the burning and wrote a book of predictions, and The Declaimer's Transcendence was one of those predictions. But that book was destroyed, save for just a few scraps that a young girl was able to save from it. Kind of ripped them out before the book was burned. Baz is like, oh, so he was the guy was shouting about a bedtime story before he attacked Deliritus, but Tax is like, no, Dad always told me that story was true, Baz. And Baz kind of just drops it because he doesn't want to argue with his brother. But interesting, what would this Cityless be doing, screaming about, kind of like a fable, right? So let's keep that in mind. And we get another quick reference to the second burning here as well, right? That's apparently when this Declaimer's Transcendence was destroyed. We saw this referenced earlier. So we had the original burning, which we've established as, what was happening in the prologue. That's where the city of Tome, which was Oration's capital, was destroyed. And we had this period after the burning where apparently illits were permitted to read, and that ended with the second burning, when any writings not in possession or of Oration's ruling libraries were burned. So that's kind of like that's when the power of the libraries was really consolidated, right? Any books that weren't in the library's possessions were destroyed in the second burning. And did you catch who led the second burning? A guy named Acktus Torchsire. So okay, so now we see why the trials that are coming up here are called the Acktus Trials, and it's like, oh, it's the name of the book, right? It's like whenever you hear that in the movie, you point at the screen, oh, he said it. You get the Leonardo DiCaprio meme going from the Hollywood movie. What was that called? Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Pointing at the screen. Yeah, so there it is. There's the title of the book. And it's also interesting that Acktus Torchsire is, obviously the namesake of Torchsire Library. it would seem, and you would seem to think that would make Torchsire more of a notable library than it is. So why have they fallen so far? Okay, right. So then we get into the last little bit of chapter 7 here, and we get Tax's reaction to Baz going on the trials, right? So obviously talk of the cityless inevitably leads to talk of how Delilah was injured, and Baz is now going on the trials. And we finally see why Baz came down here in the first place. Obviously, it was to visit his brother, but he's like, Tax, I was hoping, big brother, you have any ideas how I could get out of this? And Taxes, they are not on the same page with this, right? What an opportunity, Baz. Get out of it. This is great. It's our chance. Again, we see the rebel in him here. Maybe even more evidence of what he's planning down here in the dark. Bring a book back and read it to me. He tells Baz. And obviously Baz is not nearly as optimistic as his brother here. It's not like there were books just lying around Tome, Tax. That place was picked over centuries ago. And I guess we haven't really thought this through until this point yet, but that makes sense. Books are really valuable here, and the burning happened 300 years ago, so it's not surprising that Tome has been picked over time and time again, looking for different books, especially since we know that books are a finite resource now, not new ones are not being created. And, just this is more emphasis, too, of how difficult the trials are going to be, right? It's going to be dangerous just to get there because, the wilds have, dangerous creatures out there, and we've got the competitors who are trying to get a leg up on the other folks, and we learned that, the competitors might even target each other's speakers, so at least Baz isn't safe heading to Tome, and then you get to Tome, and then it's a ruin that's been scoured for hundreds of years already for books. So, like Baz said, they're not just laying around. It's also interesting. Baz suggests here that he hasn't read at all since Tex was blinded. So, it's been left up in the air. Well, did Baz go on with his education after his brother, had his eyes ripped out there in chapter 2? And it would seem no. Baz says he has eliminated anything that even suggested reading from his life. He, for all the guilt he feels about Tax, he doesn't want to join him, right? I'm gonna die with my eyes intact, Baz says. But this is kind of like, this is the last, this was Baz's last gasp, right? He's kind of accepted now that he is going on the trials. His brother basically makes him promise he's going to go, and that's it. So we're launching into the rest of the story here. And Tax says if you never grasp an opportunity for want of a better one, you'll never find one. That's kind of just good general life advice. And Tax the philosopher here kind of waxing away again. But I like that. If you never grasp an opportunity for want of a better one, you'll never find one. So that's, if you see an opportunity, take it, is what that's really saying. If you keep waiting around for, like the best opportunity, it's never going to come. Because every time you get an opportunity, you're like, oh, well, there's got to be one better than that coming down the road. So, act. Act, capitalize when the opportunity arises. And Tax is like, well, maybe, if nothing else, Baz, maybe this is a chance for you to escape. And Baz is like, well, I would never leave you, Tax. So, Baz not really interested in escaping. At least that's what he says here. But we'll have to see. So that ends part 2 here. Chapter 7 is the last chapter of part 2, and we'll start on into part 3 of the Acktus Trials next week. All right, so some homework. We'll be reading chapter 8 next week. This is it's a bit of a shorter chapter. We've had several, pretty long episodes here. I didn't really think the episodes were going to be going over an hour every week, but they really have been since episode 1. But this, I do not think next week's will go over an hour. Chapter 8 we'll be reading. Everyone is getting ready for the trials. It's the day everyone is leaving. Leanna wishes Baz farewell, and she gives him something. What do we think of that? And we also see Baz briefly interact directly with Rox. So we're going to have a very quick scene where Rox actually is not right with Deliritus. Rox is kind of by himself. And we see a bit of discussion back and forth between the two of them. So interesting to see how they react. And again, every time we see Rox, I'm interested to hear, are your opinions changing about him at all? For the better, for the worse? I don't know. Well, obviously I know, but I don't know your opinions. So I'd love to hear them. DTKane at DTKane.com. This week, no listener questions this week. Will ran a little dry. So definitely get those questions into me. You could drop them on the Facebook page as well, in addition to emailing them to me if Facebook is more your speed. I am at DTKane author. You can like the Facebook page over there. So let's see. This week's quest, and like I said at the beginning, get your quest answers in by next week, which February 24th. Get those answers in for all of the quests I've assigned through episode 6 here. And I left out another potentially interesting connection between Tax's tattoo and something from earlier in the book when we were discussing the tattoo earlier in the episode. So if you picked up on that, let me know. So again, what's another potential connection between Tax's tattoo and something else we saw earlier in the book? I don't know. I think this is a trickier one, but I'm not sure. But 3 experience. So this is the first 3 experience point quest I have given. So maybe that'll motivate you to get your answers in here. And last but not least, we'll leave you with a quote. I'll leave you with a quote. I'm not going to start talking about myself in the third person here. But this one comes from Robert Heinlein. Science fiction author, right? Not quite fantasy, but similar vein. So I'll take quotes from sci-fi authors as well. And this is from Stranger in a Strange Land. And the quote is, "Love is that condition in which the happiness of another person is essential to your own." Maybe a little bit sappy, maybe, but it was just Valentine's Day, right? And we definitely see some brotherly love going on here between Baz and Tax, and Tax's sadness certainly wears off on Baz. So I think this quote is applicable to this week's reading. I try to at least vaguely connect the quotes to the reading we do each week. At least that's what I've been doing so far. Love is that condition in which the happiness of another person is essential to your own. Yeah, that's a good one. All right. And I will say, too, if you have any favorite fantasy quotes, feel free to email them to me, and I might use them in a future episode. So that's a wrap for episode 6. And until next time, this has been DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Do they? Baz asked. That ought to have concerned him, but it didn't. Concerned him? Said, I started growing hair on my chest years ago. You don't need to worry over me like a kid anymore. Tax shook his head. Tax. Oh. It was burned when Acktus Torchsire led the second burning, destroying any writings that weren't possessed in the possessions of the possessed of the 3 cities' possessions. Thanks for listening to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. If you liked today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified whenever new episodes become available. If you'd like to listen to back episodes or review the show notes, visit dtkane.com/podcast. D.T. Kane's novels are available for purchase at most major online retailers, or you can purchase directly from his website at www.dtkane.com/books. You can receive a free short story and sign up for D.T. Kane's mailing list at dtkane.com/email-signup. If you'd like to connect, you can find D.T. Kane on Facebook at D.T. Kane Author or Twitter at D.T. Kane Author, or send D.T. Kane an email at dtkane@dtkane.com. See you next week.